For decades, the story of India's ancient trade connections lived almost entirely in the archaeological record, in pottery shards and carved seals and scattered beads recovered from sites thousands of kilometers apart, offering tantalizing but incomplete evidence that ancient South Asia was never as isolated as it sometimes appeared on a map. Archaeologists could see the physical objects. What they couldn't see, not directly, was the people who carried them. For over a century, this has been one of archaeology's most persistent limitations. A trade bead found in one country and a matching bead found in another, separated by thousands of kilometers, can tell you that objects moved between two places. It cannot tell you whether those objects moved through a long chain of indirect intermediary traders, each handling the goods for only a short stretch of the journey, or whether they moved through direct, sustained contact between specific communities, people who knew each other, married into each other's families, and passed genetic ancestry back and forth alongside the goods they exchanged. For most of archaeological history, that distinction remained essentially unknowable. Ancient DNA finally changed that. Then scientists compared the DNA. Researchers assembled the largest and most complete genetic analysis of Indian genomes ever conducted, and set that data directly against ancient DNA recovered from a remote archaeological site in Central Asia, a settlement in modern-day Tajikistan called Sarasm, thousands of kilometers from the Indian subcontinent, separated by mountain ranges, deserts, and roughly 5,000 years of history. The goal was to trace, with unprecedented genetic precision, exactly how far South Asia's ancient trade and migration networks actually reached, and how deeply connected the people living along them truly were. What they found didn't just confirm what archaeologists had long suspected from physical artifacts alone, it handed them something far more powerful: genetic and material evidence pointing to the very same ancient exchange network, converging on a single, startling result that reshaped how scientists understand South Asia's place in the ancient world. This is the story of what happened when scientists compared ancient Central Asian DNA to India. To understand why this comparison mattered so much, you first need to understand the scale of the genetic project that made it possible. A team of researchers, led by scientists at the University of California, Berkeley, in collaboration with the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, in New Delhi, the University of Southern California and the University of Michigan, assembled and analyzed more than 2,700 Indian genomes, by a wide margin, the largest and most comprehensive genetic dataset of Indian population diversity ever compiled. Published in the journal Cell, the research set out to untangle something population geneticists had been chipping away at for over a decade: the full, layered history of how modern Indian populations formed, stretching back not just thousands, but tens of thousands of years. The scale of what this new dataset revealed was staggering on its own terms, entirely apart from the Central Asian connection that would follow. Researchers traced a genetic history spanning 50,000 years of population mixing, isolation, and repeated bottlenecks. Moments in history when a population's numbers shrank dramatically, narrowing the genetic diversity passed on to future generations. The study confirmed with far greater precision than any previous research that present-day Indian individuals carry steppe pastoralist ancestry ranging anywhere from 0 to 45%, depending on region, caste, and community, a striking illustration of just how unevenly ancient migration events were absorbed across different parts of the subcontinent. The same analysis confirmed detectable traces of ancient Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry embedded in the Indian genome, archaic human lineages that interbred with the ancestors of modern humans tens of thousands of years before recorded history began, and whose genetic fragments still quietly persist in South Asian DNA today. This archaic ancestry finding carries its own scientific weight, separate from the Central Asian trade connection. India's geographic position, sitting directly along the migratory path that early modern humans took as they moved out of Africa and eastward across Asia tens of thousands of years ago, makes the subcontinent a genuinely important region for understanding exactly when and where ancient humans encountered and interbred with Neanderthal and Denisovan populations. Denisovans in particular remain one of the most mysterious branches of the ancient human family tree, known to science almost entirely through fragmentary remains recovered from a single cave in Siberia and a handful of sites in Tibet and Laos, with scientists relying heavily on the genetic traces left behind in modern populations to reconstruct where these ancient relatives actually lived and moved. Every additional data point confirming archaic ancestry in a well-sampled population like India's helps researchers refine the broader map of exactly how widely Denisovan populations once ranged across Asia, and how their genetic legacy continues to influence immune function, altitude adaptation, and other traits in populations living across the continent today. But it was the comparison against ancient DNA recovered specifically from Central Asia that produced the single finding researchers found most striking, because it didn't just confirm a genetic connection. It confirmed a specific, physical, archaeologically documented trade relationship, verified independently through two completely different scientific methods, arriving at the same conclusion at the same time. The site in question, Sarasm, sits in the Zarafshan Valley of modern Tajikistan, one of Central Asia's earliest known farming and metalworking settlements, occupied continuously from roughly the 4th millennium before the Common Era. Archaeologists have long recognized Sarasm as an important node in a broader network of ancient trade connections stretching across Central Asia. But its specific genetic relationship to populations on the Indian subcontinent had never been rigorously established using ancient DNA, largely because South Asia's hot, humid climate has historically made recovering usable ancient genetic material from the region extraordinarily difficult, a problem that has only recently begun to be overcome through improved extraction techniques and careful site selection. When researchers examined ancient individuals recovered from Sarasm alongside the newly expanded Indian genomic dataset, they found genetic evidence connecting this remote Central Asian settlement directly to populations on the Indian subcontinent. And then, almost as if science and archaeology had coordinated their timing, the genetic finding was independently enforced by something sitting in the physical archaeological record all along. One of the two Sarasm individuals included in the genetic study had been buried wearing shell bangles, bracelets crafted from marine shell, that researchers found to be functionally identical to shell bangles recovered from Neolithic sites in India and Pakistan, including the site of Mehrgarh, one of South Asia's earliest known farming settlements, located in what is now Pakistan's Balochistan province and widely regarded as a foundational precursor to the later Indus Valley Civilization. The shells used to craft those bangles, researchers determined, originated from marine sources in the Indian Ocean or the Arabian Sea, meaning they could only have reached landlocked Sarasm, thousands of kilometers from any coastline, through an extended overland or combined maritime and overland trade network stretching from the South Asian coast through the Indus Valley region and onward into the heart of Central Asia. This wasn't a coincidental artistic similarity between two distant cultures independently arriving at the same fashion. It was physical evidence of objects made from South Asian raw materials, crafted in a style matching South Asian workshops, being carried thousands of kilometers to Central Asia and buried with an individual who, the DNA now confirmed, also carried genetic ancestry linking back to populations along that same trade corridor. Geneticist Tara Kurdenkoff, one of the researchers involved in the analysis, described the discovery in terms that captured exactly why this convergence of evidence struck the research team so forcefully. Finding an individual wearing ornaments identical to those recovered from Neolithic sites across India and Pakistan, crafted from shells that could only have originated in South Asian waters, was a striking confirmation sitting directly alongside the genetic data, pointing toward the exact same connection. Archaeology had been suggesting this trade relationship for years, based on scattered material evidence recovered across multiple separate excavation sites. Genetics had now confirmed that the people involved in this exchange weren't just trading objects across an impersonal, indirect chain of intermediary merchants passing goods hand to hand across vast distances. They were connected closely enough and directly enough to leave a detectable biological signature in each other's populations. This finding connects to a broader archaeological understanding of how ancient South Asia's earliest farming communities actually developed in the first place. The archaeological record at Mehrgarh, where farming activity has been documented stretching back 8,000 to 9,000 years, shows early South Asian agriculture built around crops, wheat and barley specifically, that were not native to the Indian subcontinent at all, but had been originally domesticated far to the west, in the region now covered by Iran and the broader Fertile Crescent. This has led researchers to conclude that agriculture likely arrived in South Asia through the movement of Neolithic farming populations, migrating in from West Asia, carrying both their crops and evidently at least some portion of their genetic ancestry along with them. The genetic connection to Sarasm now suggests these same early South Asian farming communities weren't simply recipients of agricultural technology moving one direction along an ancient trade network. They were active, engaged participants in a much wider web of contact stretching from the Iranian plateau through the Indus Valley region and onward into Central Asia, a network of exchange, migration, and intermarriage operating for thousands of years before anyone on the subcontinent had built a single one of the great cities that would later define the Indus Valley Civilization at its peak. The significance of this finding extends well beyond a single trade route or a single ancient settlement. It fits into a larger picture the expanded genetic dataset helped bring into much sharper focus. The recognition that ancient South Asia's population formed through the convergence of at least 3 distinct ancestral streams, arriving from different directions at different points in deep history. Local hunter-gatherer populations, present on the subcontinent for tens of thousands of years, formed the deepest ancestral layer. Middle Eastern farming populations, connected to the same broader Neolithic expansion, responsible for spreading agriculture from the Fertile Crescent across much of Eurasia, contributed the genetic and agricultural foundation that gave rise to communities like Mehrgarh, and, eventually, the Indus Valley Civilization itself. Central Asian and pastoralist populations, arriving later during the Bronze Age, contributed the steppe-related genetic component now found in varying proportions. That 0 to 45% range the new study measured with unprecedented precision across different regions, castes, and communities throughout the modern subcontinent. What the Sarasm connection adds to this picture is a crucial missing piece. Direct evidence that contact between South Asia and Central Asia wasn't a single, one-directional wave of later Bronze Age migration sweeping down from the steppe, as earlier research had sometimes implied. It was, at least in part, a two-way, sustained relationship, stretching back to the very earliest Neolithic farming period, with South Asian communities actively engaging in long-distance trade, reaching deep into Central Asian territory centuries, and possibly millennia before the steppe pastoralist migrations that would later leave their own distinct genetic mark on the subcontinent. Ancient South Asia, in other words, wasn't simply a destination that later waves of Central Asian migrants eventually reached. It was already an active node in a much older network of exchange, sending its own people, goods, and genetic legacy outward in the opposite direction, centuries before the more famous later migrations that dominate most popular discussions of South Asian ancient history. Bactria-Margiana, a senior author on the study and an assistant professor of molecular and cell biology at UC Berkeley, framed the broader significance of the expanded research in terms that extend well beyond ancient trade history alone. The findings, she noted, fill a critical gap in scientific understanding of how ancient migrations, archaic human admixture, and social structures like endogamy have collectively shaped the genetic variation found across modern India. Variation that carries direct, practical consequences for understanding disease risk and informing precision health strategies for the country's more than 1.4 billion people. This is not simply an academic point. The same research documenting India's deep ancient connections to Central Asia also confirmed, in exhaustive detail, the genetic consequences of thousands of years of endogamous marriage practice across the subcontinent, consequences that include measurably elevated rates of specific inherited conditions, concentrated within particular communities, a pattern directly relevant to how doctors and researchers approach genetic screening and disease prevention for South Asian populations specifically, rather than relying on genetic reference data drawn primarily from European populations that simply doesn't reflect the same ancestral history. Shell bangles specifically carry particular significance in the archaeological record of ancient South Asia, worth understanding in more detail. Marine shell ornaments, crafted primarily from species found along India's western coastline and the Gulf of Kutch, became one of the most widely traded and highly valued craft goods produced across the Indus Valley cultural sphere, appearing consistently across sites separated by hundreds and, in this Sarasm case, thousands of kilometers. Archaeologists have documented specialized shell-working workshops at major Indus Valley sites, producing bangles through a labor-intensive process involving careful cutting, grinding, and polishing that required genuine craft expertise passed down through specialized artisan communities. The fact that a nearly identical example of this specifically South Asian craft tradition turned up buried with an individual in distant Tajikistan speaks to just how far and how consistently these finished goods, and quite possibly the artisans or their direct trading partners, traveled from South Asia's coastline into the heart of Central Asia. The same ancient trade corridor connecting South Asia to Central Asia also carried other precious materials in the opposite direction, adding further context to just how developed this exchange network had become, even at this early period. Lapis lazuli, the distinctive deep blue semi-precious stone prized across the ancient Near East and found in royal burials from Egypt to Mesopotamia, was mined almost exclusively in the Badakhshan region of what is now northeastern Afghanistan, uncomfortably close to the same broader Central Asian corridor connecting to Sarasm. Archaeologists have long documented lapis lazuli's presence at early South Asian sites, including Mehrgarh itself, confirming that valuable materials were already moving in multiple directions along this network. Central Asian and Afghan lapis flowing towards South Asia, and South Asian marine shell craft goods flowing back toward Central Asia, centuries before any of the great classical civilizations that would later become famous for prizing lapis lazuli even existed. It's worth pausing to appreciate just how difficult this kind of research actually is to conduct, and why a finding like the Sarasm connection took so long to confirm scientifically despite archaeologists having circumstantial evidence pointing in this direction for years. Ancient DNA degrades over time, and it degrades far faster in hot, humid environments than in the cold, dry conditions that have made regions like Europe and the Eurasian steppe comparatively easy hunting grounds for ancient genome recovery. South Asia's climate has historically made the region one of the most challenging places on Earth to recover usable ancient DNA, meaning that every successfully sequenced ancient genome from sites connected to the subcontinent represents a genuine technical achievement, often requiring years of careful sample selection, specialized extraction protocols, and repeated attempts before a usable genetic sequence can finally be recovered. The Sarasm samples benefited from Tajikistan's somewhat drier, more temperate climate compared to the Indian subcontinent itself, making them more genetically accessible than equivalent remains might have been if recovered from a comparably ancient site closer to India's own tropical and subtropical regions. This underlying technical challenge is precisely why the newly expanded modern Indian genomic dataset proves so essential to properly interpreting the Sarasm connection in the first place. With direct ancient DNA from South Asia itself still relatively scarce compared to other regions of the world, researchers rely heavily on large, carefully sampled modern genomic datasets to infer deeper ancestral history, essentially working backward from the genetic patterns still detectable in living populations to reconstruct the ancient migrations and mixing events that produced them. The sheer scale of this new study, spanning more than 2,700 genomes across dozens of distinct regional, linguistic, and caste-based populations, gave researchers the statistical power needed to detect a genetic signal connecting back to a single, specific, relatively small ancient settlement in Tajikistan with a level of confidence that earlier, smaller-scale Indian genetic studies simply couldn't have achieved. The implications of this finding ripple outward into how historians and archaeologists now think about the broader network of contact, connecting the ancient world across Eurasia. For much of the 20th century, the story of ancient trans-Eurasian trade tended to center overwhelmingly on the later Silk Road networks, connecting China, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean world, beginning roughly 2,000 years ago. The genetic and archaeological evidence connecting Sarasm to South Asia's earliest farming communities pushes the timeline of meaningful, long-distance Central and South Asian contact back by thousands of years earlier than the classical Silk Road era, suggesting that the mountain passes and river valleys connecting these regions had already been functioning as genuine corridors of exchange, migration, and intermarriage since the very dawn of settled agricultural life on the subcontinent, long before any of the great empires that would later formalize and expand these trade networks had even begun to take shape. None of this diminishes the significance of India's own deep indigenous genetic history, the tens of thousands of years of hunter-gatherer presence that formed the foundational layer beneath every subsequent wave of migration, and mixing the new study documented. If anything, it adds another layer of complexity to an already remarkably layered story, confirming that ancient South Asia wasn't simply a passive recipient of successive waves of outside migration arriving from different directions over thousands of years, as earlier, simpler narratives sometimes implied. It was an active participant in shaping the ancient world around it, sending its own people, its own crafted goods, and its own genetic legacy outward across mountains and deserts to a remote settlement in Central Asia, where, roughly 5,000 years later, a team of geneticists and archaeologists finally found the shell bangles and the DNA that proved it had happened. There's a broader lesson embedded in this discovery about how scientific breakthroughs actually tend to happen, one worth sitting with before this story closes. Neither the genetic dataset nor the shell bangles, on their own, would have produced the same level of confidence researchers now hold about this ancient connection. A shell bangle alone might be dismissed as coincidental craft convergence, two separate cultures independently arriving at a similar style. A genetic signal alone might be interpreted cautiously, attributed to some more distant, indirect ancestral connection rather than direct contact. It was the convergence of two entirely independent lines of evidence, one dug carefully out of the ground by archaeologists, one extracted painstakingly from ancient bone by geneticists, decades apart, using completely different scientific methods, arriving at the exact same conclusion that transformed a plausible hypothesis into something close to certainty. This is, in many ways, how the strongest claims in ancient history are made, not through a single dramatic discovery, but through independent disciplines, checking each other's work across years and sometimes decades, until the evidence converges from enough different directions that doubt becomes difficult to sustain. For India specifically, this finding adds another dimension to a national genetic story that keeps growing richer with every major study conducted on the subcontinent's population. It joins the ANI-ASI framework first identified in 2009, the direct ancient DNA evidence recovered from the Indus Valley site of Rakhigarhi in 2019, the ongoing work of India's National Genome India Sequencing Project, and now this landmark cell study connecting South Asia's earliest farmers to a remote settlement in the mountains of Central Asia. Each of these research efforts, arriving years apart, keeps reinforcing the same underlying truth about the subcontinent's ancient history. India was never a closed, isolated genetic and cultural system, quietly developing on its own before the rest of the ancient world eventually took notice. From its very earliest agricultural communities, it was already reaching outward, trading, migrating, and intermarrying across some of the most formidable geographic barriers Eurasia has to offer. Deserts, mountain ranges, and thousands of kilometers of difficult terrain, leaving behind a genetic and material record that modern science is only now fully equipped to read. Consider what this means for how we picture life in an early farming settlement like Mehrgarh, more than 8,000 years ago. It's easy to imagine early agricultural communities as small, self-contained villages, isolated by the sheer difficulty of ancient travel, and largely unaware of the wider world beyond their immediate valley. The Sarasm connection suggests something considerably more dynamic, a community engaged from a remarkably early stage in trade networks stretching across some of the most challenging terrain in Eurasia, reaching mountain settlements more than 1,000 kilometers away, closely enough that specific individuals ended up buried together, worlds apart, wearing the same style of handcrafted jewelry, carrying detectably related ancestry passed down from people who had, at some point, actually met. That is the result that emerged when scientists finally compared ancient Central Asian DNA directly against the largest genetic data set of Indian populations ever assembled. Not simply confirmation of a vague, general ancient trade relationship long suspected from scattered archaeological finds, but precise, converging genetic and material evidence, a shared genetic signature and an identical set of handcrafted shell bangles, proving that people from the Indian subcontinent and people living in a remote Central Asian valley were connected closely enough, more than 5,000 years ago, to leave an unmistakable mark on each other's history that modern science only now had the tools to finally read.